Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
For decades now, we've been told that moderate consumption of things such as red wine can be very beneficial to our overall health. And I want to talk about the true meaning of alcohol consumption, the different types of alcohol, because dealing with wine is one thing, dealing with other types of alcohol is another thing. And the real cardiovascular impacts of alcohol consumption, because we know on one hand, it is definitely been proven and shown that the phytochemicals, those polyphenols coming from the grapes, which are then made into wine, can be incredibly beneficial to the health of the heart and the entire cardiovascular system. But we also have to recognize that everything is within moderation. It's like with anything. If we overconsume, then we go from a point of cardioprotective to cardiac detrimental. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and let's get right to it. Let's talk about the impact of alcohol on the cardiovascular system. We know that alcoholic beverages have been consumed for thousands of years, predating even biblical times. So these are all things that we certainly know, but we also have to look at the difference. So when we're looking at the fermentation of different fruits, so berries and grapes, things like that, how beneficial that these can actually be for the heart. Because we're looking at those antioxidants, we're looking at those polyphenols. We're now recognizing more and more about how it is that things like resveratrol is going to work in terms of not only fending off oxidative stress, but also in terms of downregulating inflammation in the body. So we can go back and look at the French paradox, and that's the term that is coined for why it is people in France seem to have this phenomenon where there's a higher consumption of wine just as part of their daily dietary intake. They'll have a glass of red wine with their dinner. And how it is that wine consumption has led to this apparent cardioprotective potential. Now, everything within moderation, once again, because we know that excessive consumption of alcohol or binge drinking alcohol is actually incredibly detrimental to our cardiovascular system. And we can look at alcohol use and disorders of the heart. And there was a journal that looked specifically at that, and that was back in 2019. The journal is the Addiction Journal. And they were talking about how alcohol use is an important preventable and modifiable cause of different diseases. And they were looking at its effects on cardiovascular system. Now, within this particular study, they were looking at different observational studies and drawing the different links between alcohol consumption as well as cardiovascular disease. So looking at the impact of ethanol, so that's your primary alcohol, looking at its impact on blood pressure, for example, looking at the long-term impacts in terms of cardiomyopathy, so dilated cardiac myopathy. So we know that small amounts of alcohol can have this really long-lasting benefit to the heart, but we also recognize that the balance is a very finite area. And so when we're consuming too much, then we know that we are going to run into a problem, and hence we have all of these, kind of spiraling out of control impacts on overall cardiac function. So the ethanol itself can have, at some degree, a beneficial effect on the function of the heart, but we know it can also have a very detrimental effect. And this is solely based on the amount that is consumed. So when we're looking at low amounts, then clearly this is where you are going to start to see those improvements upon cardiac function. And what actually, constitutes a standard drink, that's always up for debate. And when we look at one glass of wine, is that what is considered to be the standard, the gold standard for consumption? And basically through all of the different research and even through the World Health Organization guidelines, that is basically what we have narrowed it down to. And we can see from that small amount of consumption of things such as red wine, we can really have this heightened level of cardioprotection, which is key. And it's, truly coming from those polyphenols. But now what they're starting to recognize is it's actually a balance. It's that those polyphenols can help to offset some of the negative effects of that ethanol. So the two are kind of working in synergy, one would say, together. Now, another area that is quite interesting is now that they've been able to narrow down many of these different phytochemicals or these powerful active constituents that are derived from different, say, fruits, for example, that these also can have other benefits that help to really allow the heart to function in a positive way. So this is when we go back to looking at not only the antioxidant properties, but also looking at those anti-inflammatory properties and the cytoprotective properties. So even when we're thinking about brain health and nervous system health, we certainly are starting to see this. Now, red wine consumption is the primary focus of most research because we're not going to look at, just regular alcohol, the vodkas and things along that line, or even beer, for example, because we know that the polyphenol content coming from those is only going to be a fraction of what wine would be. So this is why there is a lot of misinformation out there when it comes to, alcohol and its cardiovascular promoting properties, because it is dose dependent and it is specific alcohol dependent. And understanding that difference, then we can start to see if we have one glass of red wine, does that lead to this associated decreased risk for coronary artery disease, for diabetes, for heart failure, for stroke? Certainly this has been shown. But then we, like I said, cross that fine line, and then we can get into issues with cardiomyopathy, which is the enlargement of the heart. We can look at atrial fibrillation. We certainly know that there can be a marked increase even in both ischemic and hemorrhagic strokes when alcohol consumption is greater than it should be. So there's a lot of scientific research out there. And for many scientists, they say, don't even go down that path of, trying to moderate yourself when it comes to alcohol consumption and just go solely with the actual polyphenols themselves. So, supplementing with things such as resveratrol or grape seed extract would be advantageous. And I certainly agree with that theory because for many people, if one is good, two is better. If two is great, then hey, three must be even better. So the human brain and trying to regulate our own level of moderation, that's often a slippery slope for many people. And in the Alcohol Research Journal, they talked about that in some more detail, that, trying to get these positive effects from drinking have to be, weighed against a lot of the physiological effects. So we know that mitochondrial dysfunction and changes in circulation and inflammatory response and oxidative stress are all known in terms of being factors of damage to the cardiovascular system. And so if alcohol in one hand can offset that, but in the other hand exacerbate it, how do we know where that balance is? And this is oftentimes where the problem comes into play. And there's been numerous epidemiological studies over multiple decades looking at that association and recognizing that for some, we can go back and look at that French paradox. For some, when it's, clearly moderation, it's part of the normal dietary intake, then you start to see that heightened level of cardioprotective effects. But then you have, on that other hand, all of the issues where that greater consumption of alcohol actually is this double-edged sword and actually leads to more significant cardiovascular disease. And like I said, we can look at hypertension, we can look at coronary heart disease, we can look at peripheral artery disease. We know that the overconsumption of alcohol certainly can be incredibly detrimental to the vascular system as a whole. And so damage done to the lining of those blood vessels and the imbalance that can occur within blood glucose levels certainly can drive up excessive glycation, which can then do further damage to the vascular system itself. So there has to be a balance. And in looking at this, we can recognize, what is good versus what is not good. And I think the biggest problem probably comes down more to not what we know, but what we don't know. And what we don't know is, how good are people when it comes to their own self-regulation of intake of alcohol? And is the alcohol that they are choosing to drink, is that the preferred choice for heart health versus something that is going to actually worsen all of the cardio metabolic markers? And we certainly do see this time after time. In the Journal of Cardiovascular Medicine, they were looking at observational data suggesting that moderate alcohol consumption was associated with reduced all-cause mortality. And they found that it was, coming from those, polyphenols, those very powerful antioxidants, that this actually created this reduction in overall cardiovascular disease. And they said, one of the reasons why is that they were seeing a heightened production of HDL, which is your good cholesterol. So this is one of the things with the French paradox. The higher consumption on a regular steady basis, that one glass of red wine per day, led to a higher amount of the body producing the protective form of cholesterol, which is your HDL or high density lipoprotein. They also found that the plasminogen levels went up, as well as endothelial function improved. All of these things are things that are recognizable. Fibrinogen levels, where the blood itself is a little bit sticky, is a good way to describe that. That with that red wine, they found that fibrinogen levels actually came down. But like I said, it's that balance, and that's the hardest thing. So I get asked this question a lot, like, well, should I have red wine every single day? And, clearly based on the science, yes, red wine, one glass per day, would appear to be incredibly cardioprotective. However, that is under the assumption that you are having just that one glass, which is the difficult thing for most people. Like I said, if one is good, two must be better. If two is good, then three must be great. This is where the problem comes in, and we don't want to have the alcohol itself actually exacerbate pre-existing heart conditions. So if someone already has hypertension or an enlarged heart, then clearly you have to really adjust that alcohol intake in extreme moderation, so we're not getting more profound detrimental cardiac effects coming from that alcohol. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this, and certainly in the Journal of Circulation, they went into a lot of detail talking about, people who drink wine were also more likely to take part as a healthy lifestyle in general. So versus someone who is drinking whiskey or vodka or beer, that those who are having red wine were probably pairing that up maybe with salmon and some, fresh greens. And so it's that Mediterranean diet, it's that lifestyle that also leads to that heightened amount of cardio protection. So that French paradox, there is so much to that, but trying to translate that into everyday life oftentimes can be very, very difficult. When we talk about, one glass of wine, we're talking, 5 ounces, and that's another big issue. Someone who, pours a 10-ounce glass of wine may say, yeah, that's my glass. So it's the moderation and it's the self-regulation that really can be the most problematic thing. So at the end of the day, I always look at, having exposure to polyphenols coming from your foods or from what you're drinking, such as, green tea and red wine. Certainly, we know that these powerful flavonoids, these very potent antioxidants, do so much to fend off oxidative stress, especially when we're looking at LDLs. So that's your bad cholesterol, the low density lipoproteins. The more we can try to protect those bad cholesterol particles from becoming oxidized, the better off we are in terms of overall endothelial function. But if we are taking in too much, like I said, then we cross over to that other side where we are then basically increasing our inflammation. We are creating more mitochondrial dysfunction. We are impeding the natural release of nitric oxide in the body to create that vasodilation. So there is that balance. And so this is why I oftentimes will turn towards things such as just straight resveratrol extract, that grapeseed extract, quercetin extract, all of these things that we know can have long lasting impact in terms of cardiovascular benefits. So at the end of the day, if you are partaking in alcohol consumption, remember, it is a very fine balance between how much you take in, how much is beneficial for the heart versus when you cross that line and it then becomes a major risk factor. So this is just kind of a basic overview of many of the common things that will come up in terms of alcohol's impact on the heart. And we know that in small amounts of that red wine, very, very beneficial. Whenever we are intaking more or in that binge drinking category, then we know that we are creating more harm than we are good. So that is all that I have for you for today. I want to thank you so much for tuning in to the Invite Health podcast. You can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Now, do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.